Good to see everyone. Good to meet everyone. So I believe this morning you did land rights. Now we're moving to restrictions. How land restrictions in this session, how land restrictions affect productivity. And we have a wonderful smorgasbord of 4 different papers that with different identification strategies, different countries, different types of restrictions. We have 2 studies with legal restrictions in Colombia and India. We have 1 study of information barriers in Kenya, and we have a study with social norms in Ghana. Half of the studies are about rental, half of the studies are about ownership. For identification strategies also, we've got the whole range. We have an RCT in Kenya, we have a natural experiment in Colombia with a law that was introduced, and we have 2 studies with subnational data for identification in India and Ghana. But I think across all this variation, the bottom line is clear. Restrictions come with productivity losses. The only question is how much of a productivity loss and under which conditions the productivity losses might be smaller. And the interesting thing in this session is productivity losses not just in agriculture, but also in non-agriculture. So the 4 presenters will take 15 minutes again, and then we'll have 5 minutes discussion after each presentation. So we'll start with Lorenzo Casaburi. All yours. So that's the study, the RCT in Kenya, Lorenzo's study. So his title is a long one, so I have to read it. So Lorenzo is the UBS Foundation Associate Professor of Development Economics at the University of Zurich. And he's been there since his postdoc at Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research and after his Harvard PhD. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I thought I had more, so I just give the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting us to this conference. It's been great to see papers so far. This is joint work with Misallocation and Jack Willis. And I can really skip a bit of the motivation here. Agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa is a sector that employs a lot of people and is largely unproductive. At the same time, the market in its key agricultural input, land, let's say, they function far from perfectly. And so a natural question is, are these 2 things related? Okay, there's a lot of work, including by people in these areas. A recent emphasis on implications of land market frictions on misallocation of land. And for instance, some work, work by Diego Restuccia, for instance, and co-authors, argues that we see large dispersion in agricultural productivity across farmers, and that therefore there will be large gains from reallocating land to more productive farmers. Okay? Another line of work, for instance, work by Doug Goldin and Chris Udry, argues that productivity dispersion largely reflects an observed plot heterogeneity and measurement error. Okay, and therefore the gain from reallocation will be smaller. So we contribute to this debate by providing the first experimental evidence on the effects of land rental markets. We ran a randomized controlled trial in rural Kenya, where we subsidize landowners to rent out one of their plots, and in doing so, we therefore induce marginal land rentals. We have an additional treatment to benchmark income effect. We give unconditional cash transfers to the owners. And in the study, and we study who selects into land markets at the margins, and the effects of the marginal rentals on agricultural investment, on production, and on owner outcomes. We are going to have 2 types of counterfactual. I'm going to be describing them in the experimental design. Of course, this work relates to a large body of literature on land markets, on land rentals, a lot of observational studies, again, including by a lot of people in this room, quantitative analysis, and a small number of natural experiments using, for instance, reform in land rights or in land registries. The work also relates to a number of other related lines of research, again, including by people in this room. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk a bit about land rentals in Kenya. I'm going to talk about the experimental design. Then we can look at kind of a first stage, to which extent subsidies induce land rentals, and what can we learn about the underlying sources of market frictions, of land market frictions from these results. Then we're going to talk about impact on agricultural outcomes, investment, productivity, and the sources potentially of gains from trade. And I'll most likely just very quickly talk about the impact on owners. So we work in Western Kenya. This is a setting where there are primarily private, but let's say imperfect property rights. Rental market exists. We are not introducing them for the first time. So you should think of our intervention as moving some people on the margin, not creating a market for the first time. It's all upfront cash payment. There is no sharecropping. Why imperfect? There are self-reported frictions on both sides. For instance, owners are concerned about search costs, are concerned about renters overstaying on the land, land disputes, soil exploitation, and similar things on the other side. So you can think of these frictions as a mix of one-off and per-period costs. So what do? We started this now 5 years ago, I think. So after a pilot, we went around about 160 villages, and we gathered information on 7,000 farmers. And we collect information on their plots and on what they were planning to do with the plot in the upcoming season. And so they could tell us, oh, I'm planning to cultivate it, I'm planning to leave it idle, or I'm planning to rent out. And for the experiment, we focus only on farmers that have at least 2 plots. And then we ask, after gathering information on what they're planning to do, we ask, OK, if we offer you a subsidy on the top of the rent that you will get from the renter, would you rent out an extra plot among those that you are currently not planning to rent out? Okay? And let's say these 3 owners say yes, and these guys say no. So then we restrict to the owners that say, oh, there will be an extra plot that I would like to rent out if I get the subsidy. And importantly, we know what this plot, which this plot is going to be, which one is going to be. And we are going to call it the target plot in the rest of the presentation. It's important that we know this plot before the treatment. That's what allows us to have a counterfactual at the plot level. And then we randomize owners and target plots into the 3 groups, the rental subsidy, the unconditional cash drop, and a pure control. The rental subsidy is paid to the owners, and then they have to find a renter. So we are not fostering, let's say, optimal matches. We are allowing owners to look for a renter in the market. There are potential alternative designs that we consider and discard or that we could follow in future work. We do surveys with owners, with renters for multiple seasons. Importantly, the subsidy is given for 3 seasons. That's 1.5 years. There are 2 seasons per year. There are a bunch of extra details on the experiment that I don't have time to discuss. And so you should think of these as, look, you can think of any potential trade as characterized by a gain from trade and by a certain level of friction. And if the level of gains from trade is high relative to frictions, these trades are going to happen anyway, even without our experiment. Then there are some where the gains from trade are relatively low that are never going to happen, even with our subsidy. And then there's some marginal trades that are the ones where the benefits from trade relative to frictions are, let's say, at an intermediate level. OK, so what do we find in terms of first stage? We find that about 16% of owners say that they are interested in the subsidy. So it's not that, I mean, maybe not surprising, it's not that everybody's on the margin of wanting to rent out, even with a large subsidy. Sorry, I should have mentioned. The subsidy is about 30% of the price per acre. Okay, so that's the magnitude you want to have in the back of your mind. And yeah, so about 16% of the farmers say that they would like to rent out an extra plot if they get the subsidy. And these owners are typically larger, are more likely to claim that they don't have inputs to cultivate their plots. Okay. And so the take-up in this sample of potential comparison is still not perfect. It's 70%. Why? Because 30%, or most of the 30% who are eligible for a subsidy and don't take it up, report that they cannot find a renter. These are thin markets. There are some people who change their mind, but most of those who say who can't find who don't take up the subsidy say that they cannot find a renter. So in turn, we can see how many more rentals we induced with our experiment. So we basically see that in the control group, there's a 20% of people who rent out the target plot even without our experiment. Okay, so it's not zero, people change their mind or whatever. This goes up to 70%, and the rate is quite constant in the 3 seasons of the experiment. Interestingly, we document persistence. After we remove the subsidy, most of the rentals that we had induced experimentally persist. Okay? And they persist in season 4 and 5, so at the end of year 2 and 2.5. Following referee comments, we also went back at the end of season 8, so 4.5 years after the experiment, and we find large persistence, mostly with the same renters. So this suggests 2 potential sources of land market frictions: fixed costs or learning. So a natural form of fixed cost consistent with the fin markets is search. Search is time-consuming, is often not successful. People spend on average 3 weeks to find a renter. Not only, they only search within a pretty limited set of people, of acquaintances, of friends. Okay? So, this is going to be important because it's very different from the type of optimal reallocation or productivity, from a productivity perspective, optimal reallocation that is simulated in a lot of these more quantitative papers, which is, oh, let's give the land to the guy with the highest productivity. That's not what marginal trades look like. And then learning. Like farmers, owners were very pessimistic about land markets. They had high concerns about disputes, about the risk of renters stay on the land. And ex post, this doesn't take place. Okay, we don't see disputes. We see that owners in surveys 4 years after say that now they have much more optimistic beliefs about this, that they would like to rent even to other renters. Of course, it's not incentivized, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, but that's what we find. And there's also evidence on renters learning. For instance, renters learn how to report that they learn how to cultivate the plot season after season. Okay. So I won't go in the details of the results. I'm more interested in interpretation. But essentially, we have, you can think of an experiment, right, where we have 2 plots that are ex-ante identical. And basically, one is rented out, and so managed by the renter, and one is managed by the owner. And then there is another plot that is identical, that is managed by the owner, but now the owner has extra cash. Okay, so that's not exactly what our experiment does, but to simplify to a first pass, that's how you can think of it. And so what we find? We find that both giving a transfer to the owner and inducing a change in the manager from owner to renter increase the likelihood that the plot is cultivated from 80% to 90%, basically. But then what people do with the plot is quite different. If you give money to the owner plants more maize, which is the standard, the traditional crop in the area. If you induce a renter to take over, they plant more commercial crops. Okay, think of sugarcane and tobacco in this setting, and groundnuts, I think. And then in turn, we see that this leads to an increase in non-labor inputs for renters versus owners. There is no increase in labor, at least in the way we measure. Of course, you can quibble with how exactly labor is measured, and we can't fully address all these questions, but in turn, there is an increase in harvest value, measured at constant prices, and an increase in value added. Just to give a number, value added would be about $100 per plot. This goes up to about $135, $140 when the plot is rented out. We also measure soil quality, and at least at the end of the 4th season, so 2 years after, we don't see a negative impact on soil quality as measured in lab tests. Okay, bunch of other results, quantile treatment effects. I will skip that. So what I want to talk about are potential sources of gains from trade. So if you think of standard agricultural household models, there will be 4 domains. One will be technology. So one story is the shift toward commercial crops. So you can think of a change in the production technology on the plot. There are no gains from consolidation, of course, related to Garrett's work here. We don't find that the renters are consolidating land. These are renters who take land not close to their existing plots. Renters have higher TFP as measured in exposed data. But they also have some characteristics that may be correlated with TFP. They are younger, they are more educated. They are also more likely to be made. So from a gender perspective, you can have different interpretations on whether this is a good or a bad thing. Renters have higher labor-to-land ratios, but they don't use more labor. Okay, so they have a similar household size, they own much less land, but it's not the case that on this target plot that they rent, they use more labor. Okay, which ex ante we would have expected. It would have been a very natural channel to expect. Owners appear, and the last channel is capital, owners appear to be quite capital constrained. Indeed, giving them cash in the second treatment group increases cultivation likelihood. Renters appear to have better access to capital. They report taking out loans for cultivating the plots, and they make more investments that have high upfront costs, like hybrid seeds. Yeah, so this is just a table summarizing what I said. Now, what do we learn about market frictions? That's what I want to discuss in the last couple of minutes. So the first thing is that the first point is that for a vast majority of owners, any friction is relatively large to the gains from trade. Right? For 84% of people, even a 30% increase in rentals does not induce rentals. The second is that in a set of compliers, we can measure frictions, and we find that these frictions are quite large. It's a back of the envelope, but think of potentially as large as the rental price. Now, the last exercise that we do is we can actually try to understand the gains that are induced from these marginal trades versus the process of optimal land reallocation. And so, without going in details, what we find here, we find that we induce rentals of about 9% of the land in our data, but we only generate 2% of the predicted gains from full reallocation. And there are two potential components here. One is that the realized gains of taking up a renter are different than the predicted gains if you measured at baseline productivity and then imputed it on a land expansion. We find that this channel doesn't matter. That's I think, good news for all these more quantitative papers, in the sense that predicting renter productivity from baseline data does quite a good job comparing to actually having the treatment effects of putting the renter on the land. Now, but what happens is basically the rentals that we induce, the renter-owner matches, have much lower productivity, both, I guess, predicted productivity, because we don't see the actual one for the pairs that don't take place. So they have lower predicted gains than the optimal reallocation. Okay? And so this is consistent with the fact that the owners are not going around and looking for the person with the highest productivity, but they are searching for one where maybe the productivity is lower, but the frictions are also lower. And so one very important question is that maybe the rentals with the largest potential gains, which again are the ones that we will consider in optimal reallocation exercises, are also the ones with the largest frictions. And so they are not the ones induced marginally. So we don't see much on owners. So this is a very different type of counterfactual, the last part of the paper. We can compare an owner who rents out one of their plots, typically one out of their 2 or 3 plots on average, versus an owner that doesn't rent out. We don't see negative effects on food security, which is a big question in this literature. We don't see that these guys start working in non-agriculture. Maybe they enjoy a bit more the leisure from the rent. Okay? And there is no meaningful effects on assets or household finances. So to conclude, we experimentally induce marginal land rentals and study their effects. We find that few owners are marginals, only 16% are on the margin of a 30% benefit. Marginal rentals do lead to efficiency gains. Persistence suggests in land rentals after the subsidies, suggests potentially search cost and learning, consistent with some of our survey data. We find evidence for difference in capital, technology, and productivity as a source of gain from trade, not labor. And we find that the predicted gains from full reallocation are much larger than those induced by the actual trades induced by this type of experiment. Okay? A lot of open questions, but let me stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorenzo. So now questions. I see the first one already.
Thanks for the paper. Just a clarificatory question. Do you know something about how these contracts are enforced and written down, or I don't know, created, or did you induce it, or you just left it free?
Yeah, I take a few questions, maybe 3 questions, but that's my memory constraint. And then
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the nice paper. Do you know what's happening to the landlords and the tenants on their other plots that aren't in the transaction? I mean, that might be an interesting comparison rather than, to look across within the household across the plots to see what's happening to those outcomes.
Please.
Could you share a little bit more about the structure of rural property rights in this area? I'm thinking specifically of other cases like in Senegal, for instance, where if you rent land for 3 years, legally you could submit a claim for a long-term use right, which really constrains the long-term rental markets.
yeah, very good. So I think the first and third question are related. So we have, these are not formal rentals, they're not registered with the ministry or anything. There is some confirmation from the chief that it's also good for us because we want to give money for something that is happening. So there is a bit of that. I think for us the most important thing is that several years after, we don't see owners reporting disputes. We don't see owners reporting that the renters overstay on the land, which was a big concern earlier. And I think so related to yours, I think that this is a setting where people have typically a certificate. It could be that 2 people have the same certificate on the same land, but yeah, there are certificates. But given that these are not formally registered, there are no claims there are no claims for overstaying. Okay, and sorry, I'm getting bored. Your question again? Oh, sorry.
What was happening on their other plots?
Yes. Yeah. So no, of course we measure. We don't see spillover. We don't see, for instance, that now the owners are renting out less of the other plots, primarily because we are inducing people to rent out for the first time. Okay? We don't have a counterfactual at the renter level, so I cannot answer that. That would be another type of design, but that's a counterfactual we don't have. And a bit surprisingly, we don't see increases, or we are a bit underpowered. Maybe there's a bit more for owners who now rent out one of their plots. We see a bit of inputs increasing on their other plots, consistent with some constraints not be binding anymore. But we don't see, for instance, large effects on harvest or value added in the other plots of the owners.
Any more questions? We have time for a few more. Yes, please.
My question is about what about non-farming activities?
Yeah.
Did you see any change?
Yeah, so that's a channel we looked at. No, if anything, we find that owners who rent out one of their plots reduce a bit their labor supply in non-agriculture, which is contrary. So again, I think this is the part of the paper where the experimental design really is suboptimal, because it's very different to think, I sell and then I have a life to change my activities. But I think what we are doing is these are relatively old people, and we are making them small rentier, basically enjoying the money from rentals, and it's not that they are dying to start a new activity at this point.
But related to that, how many are within household or within relatives, and can you say a little bit more about the distribution of the new renters?
Yeah, so we have characteristics, right, of the renters. So the renters are younger, they are more educated, they are more likely to be male. So what we are doing is basically transferring land from older women to younger men. They are, I think, a large share, both in the rentals in the cross-section and in the ones induced by the experiment, is within broad families. So we are not... renters in our treatment group are a bit more likely to come from another village. So we are inducing a bit of transfers, but that's like 20%. So it's not that, we are in an integrated market and people are coming to the village. Most of the rentals are within broad families. And that's, again, consistent with the fact that the owners are not going around and looking for the best renter.
So I think so. Sorry if I missed something, but I guess you have been showing the productivity of renters, but how about the productivity gains of owners, land owners? Because how did they use the rental profits, and did that contribute to some agricultural intensification because of the extra land abundance?
If I understand correctly, you asked about the impact on productivity on other plots of the owners. So we don't see much going on.
Oh, I see.
We see a bit of an impact on inputs, marginally significant or something, but it's not that the owners are, they are not allocating much resources on other plots, which was a bit surprising for us.
So do you have a sense of how they are using the profits from renting land?
So they are investing a bit more inputs. They are buying a bit more assets. We see a bit of that, but it's not large enough that we are. It's more enough that we can't pick it up.
Great.
Yeah. And they are buying some food, so that food security doesn't go down, right? Because they are producing less.
Great.
Just a quick curiosity: is more sharecropping rental? No.
No. There's no sharecropping in this setting.
Sorry, I have a question. How do you make sure that the dad doesn't just give the plot to the son and take the rental subsidy?
Rentals cannot be within household members. And then, so let's think of, but that's an important question. So two things. One is, if this were true, we will find a larger first stage, but a low second stage, because there will be a lot of rentals that are reported as such, but are not real, and so. And then we see persistence after the subsidy is removed, at which point the incentives to misreport are muted. Yeah.
Very good. Any more questions? We have 1 more minute. If not, then it's time to move on to the next paper. Thank you very much. So the next presenter is Marijn. He's from across the road, an economist at the IMF, which he joined after his PhD at University of Toronto, which is my alma mater as well. And he will take us to India, to, again, a rental market.
But if you want to point at stuff, you can use the...
Oh, the pointers?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for having me. I have 15 minutes, right? Okay, yeah, so this is joint work with Diego and Swapnika when we were all at the University of Toronto. And it fits nicely into the literature that Lorenzo was discussing. And I think actually we might provide some analytical foundations for some of the results that you found. So I hope that I can sort of weave that into the presentation. So what are we doing? Yes, I guess this the motivation here is not really necessary for this audience. We take a macro view in this paper and of course emphasize large differences in productivity in agriculture across countries, which previous literature has linked to differences in allocative efficiency. But the exact sources of this misallocation are less well understood. From a macro perspective, partly because we haven't really opened up this box of what's actually driving the underlying frictions that give rise to what we would perceive as misallocation of resources, and then, of course, in the agricultural literature, mostly misallocation of land. So what we do in this paper is we basically study this question in the context of Indian agriculture, mainly because we, compared to previous papers, we have relatively good microdata that we can use to disentangle this question, but also, as Francisca already mentioned, we can use the subnational variation in India to relate land market institutions at the subnational level to outcomes in terms of allocative efficiency. So this comparison of states within India provides a nice, well, I wouldn't say natural experiment, but it provides nice variation. So what do we do in the paper, just to go through this relatively quickly? So we have microdata, and using that microdata, we first sketch some motivating evidence that we think already gives you a sense of that in the microdata we see evidence that rental markets help reduce misallocation. It's just that these rental markets are not very active. So what we see is that within states, we argue rentals facilitate better resource allocation. Then across states, we argue that rentals are associated with less misallocation. And then over time, we see that between the two waves of our studies, rentals also help reallocate land to more productive farmers. We then use this motivating evidence to write down a model that sort of takes the standard heterogeneous farmer model as a starting point, where we explicitly model rental markets. And it gives rise to rental market activity in along an intensive margin and extensive margin. That intensive margin, of course, being how much land you rent in. The extensive margin, the extent to which farmers are actually participating in a rental market or not. And we'll see that actually in India, most farmers do not participate. And I think this difference between the intensive and extensive margin also relates to Lorenzo's results as well. Then we model these the distortions that give rise to differences in rental market activity. One as a state-level distortion that prohibits participation in the rental market, and then idiosyncratic farm-level distortions that move the intensive margin, which I think differences in barriers to search can give rise to these idiosyncratic farm-level distortions, where I think this extensive margin would nicely map onto these cash transfers that Lorenzo discussed. And then we estimate this distortion using microdata and do sort of the standard thing where we then move on to some counterfactuals, where we argue that these distortions have a substantial negative impact on agricultural TFP, of course, that being relative to an efficient baseline, which is quite a high bar to meet. What's I think interesting relative to previous papers is that we argue that these state-level distortions that contribute to variation along the extensive margin, they contribute to about 2/3 of the reallocation gains. So, and I think that's really the contribution of the paper in this third point. Is not so much about the actual numbers that we find; it's about to what extent are these extensive and intensive margins important. Okay, so. I'm going to skip the institutional context a little bit, but I'm happy to discuss if there's questions. As probably most of you know, there's relatively large differences in institutions across Indian states, and that's some of the variation that we're exploiting. And that variation in the end leads to large variation in the rental market activity that we see across states, where there's some states where basically there's no rental market activity at all, and there's other states, most of which are actually the most productive, where rental markets are relatively active, but nowhere near what we would expect in a world without any of those frictions. And that also then translates into differences in operational skills of farms across states. Okay, so I'm also going to skip the literature. I just want to mention that I think Klaus should have been on this slide, so apologies for that, Klaus. Because actually you were a big inspiration for this paper. Okay, so what do we have in terms of data? So we use the IHDS, where we have two waves, one 2004-2005 and one 2011-2012. And we focus only on farms. I mean, basically these are households, right? So we are not looking at plot level. These are plots that are aggregated to the household level. Only farmers that cultivate a positive amount of land. So these do not necessarily need to be owners. These could also be households that are renting in. But we're only focusing on agriculture. We keep 15 of the Indian states, only the big ones, is basically because we need to have enough observations per state. And these states, they still cover 97% of India's population and more than 90% of value added in agriculture. Okay, so then what do we have in terms of farm-specific variables? In terms of output, we have quantity units across different crops and also farm-specific prices. We have quite detailed information on labor, capital, and intermediate inputs. In the end, we only really use the non-land inputs to estimate farm-specific TFP, but we argue that that information is actually quite good relative to other surveys. And then crucially for land, we know how much land is, of course, cultivated in total, but this is the sum of land that is owned and cultivated, land that is rented in, and then, of course, there's some farmers that are also renting out land. And it's really that new data that we can then use to sort of extend the sort of standard heterogeneous farmers model a little bit. Okay? So how do we measure farmer TFP? It's relatively standard. So we impose a Cobb-Douglas production function that's linear in farm-specific TFP, although that TFP is farmer and time-specific. So I'll get to that in a second. Then there's a composite input that uses capital, land, labor, and intermediate inputs, and that's decreasing returns to scale, and that gives rise to misallocation because we have the curvature in a production function, right? So in an efficient allocation here, we would expect that marginal products, that TFPRs are equal, but we're really here going to focus on the marginal product of land. So in spirit, we would, in a most efficient allocation, we would expect the marginal product of land to be equal. Okay. Now, like I already said, we can back out a wave-specific, farm-specific TFP level, but then, of course, that TFP is going to be impacted also by wave-specific factors like climatic factors. So we then use that variation across the waves, but also across districts to purge out location and time-specific factors, and that leaves us with what we call permanent TFP, which helps us a little bit with a measurement error, and it's that TFP that we're going to be linking to some evidence on these rental markets. Okay, so what do we then see? That within states, what we see is that more productive farmers are more likely to rent in. And farmers that condition on their TFP own more land, they're more likely to rent out. Okay, so that suggests that rentals facilitate a more efficient allocation of land. Now we also see across states that in terms of basically the dispersion of marginal products of land, states where rental markets are more active, this dispersion of a marginal product of land is lower. This is also conditional on farm-specific TFP and a whole bunch of controls. So that's the cross-states evidence. And then when we look between waves, we see that in states where rental markets are more active, farmers tend to move closer to what we would expect them to towards the amount of cultivated land that we would expect given their TFP level. So this is what we call this reallocation potential. We see that between the two waves in states with more active rental markets, farmers move closer to this potential. Okay, so that motivates the model. The model is quite standard. So we have some states. There's a land endowment, which serves as this composite input. There's a homogeneous output. Land cannot be sold. Basically, in the data, what we see is there's almost no land that is sold for our households, and then farmers are going to choose the amount of land that they rent in and that they rent out, given also the amount of land that they own. And farmers face idiosyncratic rental costs, which we model as taxes on a state level, but we can also do this at the district, state level land price. Okay, what do we then expect? I mean, this is a whole bunch of math, but in the end, what we expect is that given the state level tax that farmers are facing, farmers that have very high marginal product of land are more likely to rent out given the tax. But if this tax is large enough, we'll basically won't have any rental market activity because for the farmer that wants to rent in, it's too expensive, and for the farmer that wants to rent out, the income is too low. Okay, so we have basically this inactivity zone. Now then we apply some, we impose some a functional form here. That's basically for us to bring the model to the data. Here, this clicker is not sure it's working. Okay, you can't see it. There's going to be tau in here is the, yeah, I think. No, yeah, I'm trying to use the pointer, but yeah. So tau in here on the top is going to be the overall tax. Sorry, tau s here is going to be the overall tax, which can be applied either on the renter or on the farmer that's renting out. Here we apply it on the farmer that's renting out. And then we have the standard idiosyncratic distortion. Okay. We calibrate the parameters in orange to match corresponding moments in the data. Now the kappa here is going to be normalized. The theta here we basically use to match the covariance between marginal product of land and TFP. The variance of epsilon we're going to use to match the variance of the marginal product of land, so that can also reflect measurement error. And then tau S here, which is the state level tax, is calibrated by matching the share of households that are renting in. So this is rental market activity in the data. Now what does this look like? Basically it looks like what you would expect, right? Is the theta is larger in states where there's more co-movement between the marginal product of land and TFP. Epsilon is larger where there's this variance of the marginal product of land is larger. And then tau is going to be larger in states where rental market activity is relatively low, right? So here we're also plotting the share of households renting in. On the right-hand side, you can see, right, there are states where more than 20% of households are renting in, and there are states where basically 0% of households are renting in, okay? Now, this is the model fit. Then what do we do in terms of our counterfactuals? We have 3 counterfactuals. One is the efficient allocation, which is achieved by eliminating all land market distortions. Second is the counterfactual in which there are no idiosyncratic distortions, but we still keep this state-specific tax, this wedge. And then third is a residual, which is the difference between 1 and 2. It's really this residual that reflects the contribution of the state-level wedge, so really the state-level barrier to participating in the rental market, and we'll see that that residual is actually relatively large relative to the contribution of the idiosyncratic wedge. Okay. So we can show that we can show here the average for India and the state-level results. So what we see is that overall TFP increases by 38%. Efficient allocation, that's really not that interesting because that's just kind of like standard. But then we see that removing the idiosyncratic distortion contributes only a third of productivity gains, whereas the remaining 2/3 is coming from removing the state-specific land distortion, which to us suggests that it's really these barriers to participating in the rental market that are most important for driving differences in allocative efficiency, not so much the idiosyncratic distortions. Okay. Now I think I'm already over time, so let me just conclude here. I have time? Oh, okay. Okay. Then so what's driving these productivity gains, right? So what we see is there's a big change in the share of farms that are renting. So along this extensive margin, the share of farmers that are renting roughly triples from 10%. And then on the intensive margin, the share of land that's operated by the most productive farms doubles. Anyway, I thought I was out of time, so let me just conclude here, and I'm happy to take more questions. So just to wrap up, we examine large productivity difference across Indian states, where we basically pose the hypothesis that much of these productivity differences in agriculture are related to barriers to participation in the rental market. We provide motivating evidence that these barriers are important, and then we run some counterfactuals which suggest large potential for TFP gains. I wouldn't say it's necessarily huge, but the large potential for TFP gains if these distortions are removed. Of course, using the method that we're taking here is really setting a very, very high bar. Some food for thought just to end. Most of course, of the difference in agricultural TFP across states after running our counterfactual remain unexplained. And a lot of which could be basically due to two things. One is that in terms of how we're measuring TFP, a lot of the differences in productivity are absorbed by the district level fixed effects, which could be reflecting, of course, actual geographical differences, but could also just be absorbing some inherent differences in farmer productivity. And of course, we are not exploiting any other factors that can interact with farmer behavior when land distortions are lowered, including barriers to adoption of technology. And then, of course, also a point that was raised at the previous presentation, selection in and out of agriculture, also because we don't have the data in this setting. So let me stop there, and then happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Any questions? Then let me. There's a question, please, Lorenzo. Go ahead.
So I haven't followed all the models, but so would there be another layer of frictions that is like idiosyncratic? Sorry, not idiosyncratic. Fair specific. If you think of the frictions to enter land market, it could be like a low friction of renting from person A, but a high friction of renting from person B. I'm trying to relate to some of the things in the paper. Would that type of extension be meaningful in this context or not really?
Yeah, you could. It's just we don't have. I was actually thinking about that when I saw your presentation. We don't have we don't have any information on. We of course we know who the renters are. We know their TFP. We know what they're doing, but we don't know who they're actually renting from. Right? They might actually be renting from households that are not in our data set. But yeah, nothing. If you have that data, nothing is stopping you to extend the model and then bring in basically richer frictions that can then microfound some of these idiosyncratic distortions.
To know if I'm renting from somebody out of my village, so maybe there's something to be done there. It's very different shares of renting within versus outside the village relative to the non-renting.
Yeah, that can be done. Yeah, I mean, in the end, the model that we write down is restricted by the data that we have, and in this setting, we don't have it. But yeah, it's a good point. What do you think?
Thank you. Any more questions? Then let me add one question. So essentially, it depends on differences across states, which you attribute to land distortions. But it doesn't have to be land distortions, right? Could be anything. Could be access to finance, could be number of roads, could be anything that distinguishes states, right?
So you mean this tau S, the state-specific wedge, or
Yes.
Anything that prohibits participation in the rental market can fall, would fall under tau S. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? Well, then I think it's time to move to the next presentation. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Our next paper is by Julian Arteaga, who's just finished his PhD in agricultural and research economics at UC Davis, I believe. So congratulations.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to the previous two presenters. Super cool papers. Tough act to follow. But let me just get started. The first piece of motivation for this paper is this observation that it is common for governments around the world to restrict the transfer of land between individuals. Examples of these are very diverse, both geographically and historically, and the form that these restrictions take also varies quite a bit. Governments can impose just the outright ban of sales. They can use this sort of use it or lose it kind of property rights or community level property rights where transfer is limited. And they can also impose limits on the amount of land that any individual can own, which is what I'm going to study in this paper, the so-called land ceilings. And so it goes without saying, like in economics, we tend to think of these restrictions as just introducing distortions, like the previous two papers talked a lot about frictions in land markets. And I think a fairly well-established literature shows that these restrictions are probably a major driver behind the agricultural productivity gap fact. But the second piece of motivation for this paper is this observation that land in many developing countries, particularly in Latin America, is both highly concentrated, so very high Gini indices, and notoriously underutilized. So a large share of land in Latin America is devoted to very low intensity cattle ranching, or is plainly just left out fallow, right? And I guess a third important stylized fact about land markets in Latin America related to the previous presentation is that rental markets are very, very thin. So most people who operate land own the land they are operating. And the thing with this combination of concentration and underutilization is that it might be indicating the presence of other types of market failures. So this is an idea I read first in a paper by Jonathan Conning. It might be that this combination of very large, very unproductive estates reflects imperfect competition, right? Like some sort of market structure where large landholders have incentives both on the sort of monopoly side of land to restrict land from markets, to mark up land prices, but also to have these very large estates in a way to suppress labor demand and push down wages, right? So you want to have very large estates in a way to fend off competing firms from entering the market, avoid that increase in labor demand, and keep wages low, right? And if you have this market structure, then you can have very large, very unproductive farms as an equilibrium, right, in the long run. And I'm not saying that policymakers in Colombia make this argument, but this argument could be used as a rationalization for restricting land markets, right, and try to limit land concentration. But we really don't know if this is the case, if there is any like empirical justification to the imposition of these restrictions. And in this paper, I try to investigate this question and try to measure if there is anything to this argument of market power in agricultural land markets. And if it is the case, then I think the case to lifting or imposing restrictions gets a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated, because there might be distributional implications on whether we impose or lift restrictions on land markets. So on the empirical part, I'm going to examine this 1994 law that was imposed in Colombia that I think is just like very special to understand this question, because it imposed land ceilings at the municipality level that, because of the way the law was designed, varied across municipalities. So you have land ceilings of different heights within the same country. And just to give you a preview of the results, I do find that imposing these restrictions, municipalities that had lower ceilings, meaning like higher restrictions, did see a drop in productivity, in land productivity measured as revenue per hectare, of roughly 14%. But consistent with this idea of market power, this drop is driven mainly by municipalities where land concentration is initially quite low, right? So in municipalities where you think that land markets are relatively well behaved and operating competitively, then restrictions are clearly just a distortion that lowers productivity. But in municipalities where there are other sources of inefficiency, then the case is not so clear-cut. And in line with that, I find that the imposition of these restrictions also increased agricultural wages and increased the number of workers employed in agriculture. And this combination of simultaneous increases in the quantity of workers and the price paid to workers is indicative of restrictions having curbed market power of large landholders. So I rationalize these results in a heterogeneous agent model where some agents internalize the fact that their input choices change input prices, and then where there is like this imposition of limits on the amount of land you can own. And you can show numerically that that the results I find in the reduced form are consistent with this type of market structure. So I would like to go briefly over the important parts of the context. Colombia has had like a very large, very ambitious public land allocation program. So at least since the 1960s, the government has been uninterruptedly giving land to small landholders. By now, it's almost like at least 550,000 allocations. This amounts to 22.3 million hectares, which is roughly half of the land privately owned in Colombia nowadays. And from the pictures, I just wanted to like indicate that most of this land has been allocated in the form of small plots to landless or barely landless landholders. And despite the fact that 50% of the land has been allocated this way, like land concentration in Colombia is still very, very high. And this suggests that some process of reconcentration has been taking place, right? On top of this fact of very high land concentration levels, we have the observation that land is also heavily underutilized. And I feel I need to say that I added this slide months before I knew I was coming to this point. And so like people have been thinking about this for a long time, and I think you can argue that reconcentration processes can be explained by failures in capital markets or some other type of frictions, but the combination of concentration and underutilization is a little bit harder to explain. And I think this idea of there being underlying market power does just that. These are just two quotes from the Colombian context. I'm going to skip them, but just to say that this idea of markets, just unrestrained markets devouring smallholders, is very present in the political debate. And if you go to the data and if you organize all of these government allocations by cohort and just follow them across time, what you see is that these cohorts, like a substantial share of them, get resold pretty quickly after being allocated, and they tend to become concentrated across time, and that these patterns are more intense in municipalities that had initially higher concentration levels. So places that are more initially concentrated tend to sort of buy off new entrants to the market and reconcentrate this land more strongly. This is, of course, just like descriptive. And in order to try to go a little bit more empirically to a question of what these restrictions might do, I'm going to study this particular law, which imposed limits on the amount of land individual could own. And the explicit aim of this law, stated in the law, in the letter of the law, was to reduce land concentration. So that's what the law was set to do. Yesterday, in the last session I was in, there was like a very interesting conversation of whether or how this maps into changes in welfare, reducing land inequality. But the law explicitly stated that they wanted to reduce inequality. But because, like political negotiations, a lot of people were saying this was an impingement on freedom of property rights, then the political sort of agreement was that this limit would only apply to the land that had been allocated by the government before. So half of the country fell under this law at varying shares between municipalities, right? So municipalities that received a lot of allocations are going to be very highly restricted. Municipalities where no allocations took place basically have no limitations on land reforms. And because the ceiling height was very vaguely defined to represent the amount of land a household requires to earn a decent livelihood, and because they wanted to account for changes or differences in land productivity, land quality, agroclimatic conditions, then they decided that ceiling height was going to vary across broad regions. Congress defined something called relatively homogeneous zones, something like 100 zones across the country, and they just imposed varying ceilings of varying heights on each of these zones. And a final detail that's important to know is that this wasn't like a very aggressive reform like in other examples. It didn't entail expropriation of currently owned plots. If you were above limit before the imposition of the law, the government wasn't going to take your land away and redistribute it. this only applies to future sales, right? It applies to all plots that have been allocated, but it's not retroactive in the sense that it's going to redistribute land away. And so this is just the distribution across space of these two types of cross-sectional variation that I'm going to use to estimate the impact of the law. Let me just go to the empirical strategy. The idea is that places with lower ceilings, where you reach the limit faster, are going to be more restricted, and places where more land in the municipality falls under this restriction is also going to be, markets are going to be more restricted. So I define this market restriction strength measure, which is just the multiplication of the reciprocal of the ceiling height times the share of the municipality. And because there are clearly like large regional variations in ceiling height, and this has to do with the geography of the country, then I'm going to restrict in the estimation the comparison to municipalities that share a border, that are neighbors, but that straddle this homogeneous zone frontier, where on one side ceiling height is one, and on the other height is the other. And the intuition, I guess, is that anything that we think can influence agricultural productivity, agroclimatic conditions, or soil quality should vary smoothly across municipal boundaries. But there is this discrete jump in the stringency of restrictions just because of the way the law was designed. And so with this market stringency measure, I'm going to run a difference in difference model that includes these municipality level fixed effects and then these municipality pair times year fixed effects, right? So the identification of this estimation sort of relies on the assumption that changes in stringency across municipalities that are neighbors is as good as random, right? And this, I mean, just for context, this is like the same estimation strategy that people studying the effect of minimum wages here in the US use, comparing counties that straddle a state border, right? Where minimum wage changes at the state level. So this identification assumption I really cannot test, but you can sort of check within these municipality pairs if there is any selection on observable characteristics. I really don't find a lot of differences in either geographical or sort of closeness to markets or market access or land quality measures between these municipalities. And so if we don't observe differences in observable characteristics at the cross-section, maybe it's harder to argue that there are differences in non-observable characteristics that vary across time within these municipality pairs. Okay, let me talk briefly about the data and the outcomes. To measure agricultural productivity, I learned very late in this project that there is no municipal productivity data for Colombia for this period, so I had to go to government archives and look at the publications that they made at the time. This is all physical copies of publications the government did. Actually, state governments did during this period. With the help of an array, we digitized this, and this is something I'm proud out of the paper. This is the first comprehensive set of crop times municipality times year yield data for this time period for the country. I'm going to aggregate all of this at the municipality year level as a measure of revenue per hectare, just using FAO prices. To measure land sales, I'm going to use this very, very detailed, very rich data set on the transaction history of all plots that have been allocated by the government. So this 50% of land that I spoke at the beginning, we have all the history, all the formal history of transactions these plots have undergone. So we can know who bought from whom or who inherited to whom since the moment that these plots were allocated until 2014. And we can see many different types of transactions, right? So the whole transfer of a plot, or whether the plot gets split in two, whether two small plots get consolidated, mortgages, successions, anything that needs to go on a public notary. For that concentration, I'm using, so land sales are very rich, but they are for a selected sample of plots. So for land concentration measures, I use cadastral data, which is at the municipality level. And for labor markets, I use household surveys and the population census. So all of this gets aggregated at the municipal level. It's an unbalanced balance of most of the country across 17 years. And this slide is just like the summary of the results of the paper. I find that after the imposition of these restrictions, more restricted municipalities experienced a higher prevalence of land sales every year, slight decreases in land concentration, which was the stated objective of the law, and permanent decreases in revenue per hectare, right? But at the same time, I do find that agricultural worker earnings, like taken as a proxy of agricultural wages, also increase after the imposition of the law. And just let me go briefly over each of these results. Briefly. The result of restrictions increasing land sales at first to me was a little bit counterintuitive and hard to explain. But I think it makes sense if you think that these limits get imposed. People adjust on some margins. Some people might sell land. Some people might shrink the amount of land. Or some people want to evade the government and they just split their land and give one to a son and one to a brother. So when you look at like what specific type of transactions are taking place, you can see that after the imposition of these restrictions, transactions that fragment the land increase almost as much as transactions that consolidate land decrease, right? So there seems to be sort of adjustment of people just moving towards smaller plots. Regarding farm size distribution, I wish I had better measures of farm size distribution. I only have average sizes and the Gini index for each municipality. But there is a slight decrease in concentration measures after the imposition of the law. And then, I guess, like what drove this project was the question on what effect there is in productivity. And I do find that there is like a significant, economically significant impact on revenue per hectare after the imposition of this law. And this is just suggestive, but it seems if you look at the specific type of crop, this is yields, it does seem that the reduction in yields comes from crops that you would expect to have like a comparative advantage at scale, right? So we see that actually crops, at least in Colombia, coffee and plantain are cultivated in very small operations. Those actually increase in yields. And sort of to tie it back to the market power story and to a theoretical model, if you split this result of productivity between high and low initial concentration, so before the enactment of the law, you see that this negative effect on productivity is driven mostly by municipalities that were initially low concentration, right? So where you would expect market power to not be a very big concern, right? If you look at municipalities that have high concentration, the effect is still negative, but it's a lot smaller. And finally, I do find that there is this like simultaneous increase in the amount of workers occupied or the share of workers occupied in agriculture and the wages they are receiving, right? I do not find any results on the share of people living in rural areas, and I thought this would have been an interesting result whether land market restrictions are an obstacle to this structural transformation process. I really don't find any results there. And just to give you an idea of the magnitudes of these results, like it goes all the way from 41%. This is a municipality that receives sort of the average restriction strength measure. It goes all the way from 41% for our agricultural worker earnings to minus 13% in land productivity and everything else in between. So, as I said, the paper draws out a model where agents are heterogeneous in skill and where some of them internalize their effect on input prices, and where I compare how this market structure responds to the imposition of restrictions, to limits on the amount of land that each person can own, and compare just the competitive scenario with this market power case. And you can see in that stylized model that it can reproduce these results. So you find drops in productivity in relatively egalitarian economies, but as concentration becomes higher, market power becomes like a larger distortion on this economy, then it's not clear that imposing restrictions is necessarily worse for efficiency. And if you add this occupational choice component, then you can even get this sort of disjoint effect of productivity and wages on both sides. So to conclude, I think the punchline of the paper is that land ceilings did reduce the productivity of the agricultural sector. It did hold back agricultural productivity. But within that reduction, there are still distributional implications, and it might be that these restrictions benefited a particularly vulnerable part of the population, which is landless wage workers. And more broadly, I guess the paper wants to communicate this idea that market power and land concentration is also something that should be held in mind when talking about these policies, when trying to study this question of agricultural productivity. And at least in Colombia, the debate right now is not whether they should impose these restrictions, but rather whether they should lift them. And I think the debate is still very much open, but it should be kept in mind that lifting these restrictions might harm a very vulnerable population. Beyond that, allocation policies should also be taken into account in this consideration. And just to finalize, the idea that the first best policy in this situation, the standard, antitrust policy that a government should take is just to break big estates and try to restore competition, but that's usually politically very costly for governments. So if we are in this sort of second best scenario where there are distortions from market power and there are distortions from restrictions, and you cannot get rid of market power, then it doesn't follow that getting rid of the other restriction is necessarily welfare improving. So there might be some sort of optimal restriction level or optimal taxation level that makes it harder for large landholders to encroach on the land of smallholders and sort of increase these market power effects. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, time for questions now. Yes.
Thanks for the paper, and I like that it ends with a question mark. It's always a good paper when it opens up questions. So it's more a consideration, general consideration. I see that these restrictions put by state on the market, on the land market, often mimics something that is also in the customary rights of local populations. So the idea that village land cannot be sold or cannot be really transferred without the community consent. And I was thinking about this morning as well when we saw that the Mapuche in Chile tend to lose their land when the market operates. But that could be, or maybe, another question. Cannot it be that maybe introducing a market in a setting where the customary institutions are not market based or are already market restricted is kind of a shock too strong, and maybe these kind of policies that you are describing here could be made as a transition policy. I'm thinking about sunset laws or stuff. In the US you have these laws that has to be rediscussed after a determined period of time, and they come back from the Roman law. And stuff like this could be interesting to investigate.
Should I go at it?
Let me see whether there's another question. Yes, why don't you go ahead?
So I have a question about the method. So if I understood correctly, you're restricting your analysis to municipalities that are close to each other along the border of this zone. So I failed to see how many of these you are using and how, if they're representative of all the others that you're excluding.
Thank you. Maybe one more question? Yes?
So, super interesting paper, really enjoyed it. And this might be maybe a second paper, but I was also interested in thinking about the political consequences of the reform you're talking about. I like this point that you have at the end about second best policy. You can imagine this policy, though, then makes the political environment different, which then has other benefits in the future. So thinking about how it impacted politics would be really interesting. If concentration went down, what happened?
Over to you.
Great, thank you. Super hard question, Solomon. So maybe starting with the methods one, Yeah, so I don't have it in the slides. There is a map showing sort of the estimating sample after you restrict out the municipalities that don't have a neighbor with different ceiling height. In the end, because there are so many zones, it's almost 100 zones out of 1,000 municipalities. The large majority of municipalities have at least one neighbor which has some discrepancy in ceiling height. But I should have an answer about the representativity. I haven't done that. Like I haven't compared like the full sample against this. Absolutely right. Regarding like the first question out, I think maybe there were two questions there. One is about if there were institutions here that sort of mute the effect of the law being imposed in the first place. I don't know if that is the case. What I can tell you is that this is being done on sort of privately held down land, which means excluding any of the indigenous reservations, any of the community-owned lands, which is a substantial share of land in Colombia. This is done over plots that have like a single individual owner and which is free to transact until the imposition of the law. So I don't think, and also the fact that you see that the law does something, that it does increase transactions, means that it wasn't just like overlaid on top of some already existing institutions. But regarding the other point, I think, which is like whether this should be sunsetted or whether there should be some term limits to imposition of the law, I think that is exactly the type of policy that you should try to investigate if you agree that market power is a concern. It's like maybe you need to allow enough smallholders to enter a market until market power is really not that big of a concern, and then you can lift all restrictions and allow sort of efficiency-enhancing trades to occur. I hope that sort of goes to your question. And then, yeah, regarding the political consequences, I think that would be super interesting to look. So this law occurred by itself. It's like a law that was discussed and passed by itself in Congress. But at the same time in Colombia, like many things were happening politically. The conflict was starting to like become very, very big. Yeah, I think I don't see, like, if the identification assumption holds, there shouldn't be differences in political, pre-trends or violence within these municipality pairs. And I think there's something there that could be looked at, definitely. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
And share of land transferred originally from public land, right? There's another layer, which is how far the ceiling is from the baseline distribution. And yeah, and so I was right. Suppose that two municipalities have the same share of land from the public sector, from the government land, the same ceiling, but have different distributions at baseline. One is many people are very close to the ceiling. The other, many people are far from the ceilings. You would expect different for stage. And I guess a related point is, can you test if there is bunching? Do you have sufficiently granular data? I didn't catch that.
So just to make sure I understood, each municipality has a distribution of land sizes, right? Some above, some below ceiling, but you're referring to sort of the fraction of people below ceiling in each municipality.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the fraction or the tail, I guess.
Or the integral of the PF. Yeah, that's something I can definitely do. I hadn't thought about that. One thing is that you can be above ceiling, and after the passing of the law, like nothing will happen to you. The only thing that you cannot do is keep expanding, right? You cannot buy any more land. But yeah, definitely that's like another margin that could be exploited. Regarding bunching, yeah, so this is a question I've gotten in the data for the whole sort of national level distribution. When you sort of center it around each municipality's threshold, I don't find bunching. If you zoom like close enough to the ceiling, then you find something, and like, but I really don't know what the evidence or the proof there is. Like, I can get bunching depending on how narrow the zooming is, But I think that's a little bit like cherry picking, and I'm not sure what the standard is there to claim that there is bunching. But it is something that puzzles me, and maybe it's because it's like a different data set where you can look at bunching. But yeah, I've received comments in that same line, and I don't know why I don't observe it like in the national distribution.
So what about renting? If you couldn't buy more, I mean, did they start renting more?
Yeah, so here I need to like lean very hard on the assumption that rental markets are very, very thin, almost inexistent, which you see in the data, and which is something that like people in Colombia kind of assume that rental markets are really very low. But if you could rent land, then this whole thing changes, because then you can, like have very large estates, but then rent them out, and that's even more profitable for the large landholder. We don't see that in the data. We don't see, like, both in the national surveys of landholders, agricultural land survey, I think the latest data point is 2019, and it's something like maybe less than 5% of people rent out their land. And the picture of like very large estates in Latin America with nothing on them is very prevalent, right? So there is something impeding the actual renting of land there. Yeah.
I just had a question around the identification strategy and the market power argument. So my guess is that market power is the same on either side of any one of these boundaries. And so I would have thought then that you can't test the market power effect, and what you're really testing is just a consolidation kind of effect, that on one side of the boundary you have less consolidation, on the other you have more, but you have the same level of market power everywhere?
I mean, market power varies across municipalities. The first thing is I don't actually have like a very clear measure of market power. It's just Gini indices of land concentration in each municipality. I guess the empirical strategy estimates the impact of the imposition of restrictions, right? And then there is a heterogeneity depending on whether the municipality has high or low land concentration, and that itself acts as a proxy of whether market power is a big or low concern in land markets in that municipality, right? I don't think the paper is estimating. I don't think the empirical strategy directly estimates the effect of market power. It's estimating the effect of restrictions and then trying to gauge how important the underlying market structure is for this effect.
Any more questions? With that, actually, I think there's time for me to add one more question. Sorry, I'm a macroeconomist, but looking at this, it looks like you find that productivity is lower in states that are more restrictive. But that should be in municipalities that are more restrictive. That should be supercharged in those municipalities where you have a lot of what you call these fragmenting sales. Right? The effect should be much stronger when you have lots and lots of these fragmenting sales. You should get a big boost to productivity. Did you ever try interacting with the share of sales in the municipality that are fragmenting?
So
or the number?
Just to make sure I understand. So you are thinking once these restrictions are imposed, productivity falls because you cannot get economies of scale. And then in these places where, particularly in these places where fragmentation took place, productivity should fall even more.
No, you have, when you have to reform, the municipalities, there's some municipalities where lots of people start selling their land. So it goes to people who manage better and you get productivity gains, right? Because so the inverse of your coefficient, negative coefficient, which is the higher the restriction, the lower the productivity.
Correct, yeah.
So in those municipalities where lots of people are selling their land, you should really get an increase in productivity, right? You should have an even bigger effect if you interacted it with the number of fragmenting sales.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are two things happening. So there are some sales that sort of are productivity enhancing in the sense that large landholders who were holding very inefficient large farms reduce their land holdings, sell some of the land to potentially more productive But the other part of the story, and it's related to like this existence of frictions in land markets and wedges in misallocation, is that these restrictions also turn people away from their optimal land size. So it might be that you own the optimal farm size and this restriction gets imposed and you become scared of the government taking away your land, so you split your farm into, and now you're operating a smaller farm than you would. So in the end, it's unclear if the effect is positive or negative. But I do think there is something out. Looking at places with more and less sales, I don't know if you can interact with that because it's an outcome in itself, but maybe look at different trends in places where there were more or less sales. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can move on to the last presentation. So this was all about legal restrictions. Now we move to social norms in Ghana and the restrictions that they impose. Nathan Barker is a postdoc at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He just finished his PhD a couple of years ago at Yale.
Okay. And is there a clicker? Just, okay. Great. All right, so thanks everyone for being here. So my presentation asks about the questions of the effects of female land inheritance on occupational choice and productivity in Ghana. And when I'm giving this talk in a more general audience, I focus on structural transformation and how cultural institutions mediate this process. But I think specifically in the context of this audience, I'll focus on a few other things as sort of, I think, key ideas and takeaways. First, I would say that the consequences of land institutions and sort of who has rights, who can sell, who can inherit, is going to fundamentally depend on an individual's outside option relative to farming. And for different types of individuals, it's going to be different outside options. The second is that we talk a lot about sort of more formal property rights versus customary land tenure. And what I'll emphasize today is that customary land tenure is not a monolith, but rather that there are different customary rules which are going to have different consequences. Indeed, much of the land in Ghana is managed by chiefs and by skins and stools, but there are very different consequences under these different systems for different types of people. And the third is that frictions in different markets can amplify each other. So talk about a norm of female-only or male-only inheritance and what happens when it's relaxed. And I'll argue that it's amplified in effect by interacting with frictions in other markets. So for example, in the land market with respect to sales and rentals, as well as other barriers that women face in the labor market. And so fundamentally what I'm studying today in the variation I'm exploiting is variation in inheritance regimes in Ghana. So roughly half of the population practices patrilineal descent, where land passes from fathers to sons, and where it's very unlikely for women to inherit land. In contrast, the other half practice matrilineal descent, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I would say that it's important to know that this interplay of matrilineal descent has interacted with colonial institutions to create ambiguous rules in which both men and women can inherit. So there's this discussion of an open texture that allows for sort of ambiguity, which in this context means that both men and women do inherit land. And so I'm going to study these differences in combination with returns to different sectors and how selection into these sectors interact with these. The core insight of this paper and of this study is that male and female inheritance generate asymmetric impacts because of the differences in outside options available to men and women. So when women inherit land under matrilineal, they respond by managing farms, supplying labor to the agricultural plots. As a result of this, men are more likely to be exiting agriculture and working in the labor market, and moreover, in anticipation of this, are investing more in their own schooling. In contrast, when men inherit land, they similarly respond by supplying their own labor to the agricultural plots, but because women face barriers to entering into the labor market, they're not entering into the labor market in the same degree. Instead, they're supplying labor to male-owned plots and are working less in total. And so the net effect I find is that this more flexible system of inheritance that allows for female inheritance improves economic productivity, operating primarily through the channel of improved male labor productivity. And basically, there's two mechanisms that facilitate this. First, I estimate and find that cognitive skill, so human capital, cognitive ability, is rewarded in wage labor, but not in farming, at least when observed in this national sample. And so this increased flexibility allows men to better capture the returns to their skill. They're going into occupations where they're better able to be rewarded for their human capital. And then second, I estimate a level effect, where wage labor, even at the very lowest levels, yields higher earnings than being most levels of landholding. So being a 75th percentile landholder is roughly equivalent to being the bottom quartile of a wage earner. So for most individuals, there seem to be benefits associated with moving out of farming. And then in contrast, I find that the agricultural productivity is not affected, and it's the same across the two regimes. And effectively, I find that women face a total factor productivity penalty relative to men, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is. And so matrilineal also has more female farmers, and so you might think that might lead to a reduction in productivity overall, but I find that the male-female gap is small under matrilineal, so effectively leading to a net effect where agricultural productivity is the same across the two regimes. I can't reject that they're equal. And so this suggests that these male-only inheritance regimes practiced under patrilineal negatively affect economic productivity beyond their effects directly on wealth inequality. And so why this happens is basically driven by three frictions. So first, the motivating fact that I've talked about in this study is that patrilineal imposes a male-only inheritance constraint. So if you're a parent or you're an individual deciding who to pass land to, under patrilineal there's this constraint that only men can inherit land. That's relaxed under matrilineal. Second, though, inheritance does not extend to the financial market. So I observe in my sample something like 4% of land that people own is purchased and another 4% is rented in or out. In general, in this context, it's customary tenure where you gain the use of rights, but not necessarily the rights to sell or pass it on. And so we might think that if this second friction didn't exist, right, that there would be differences in wealth who gets the land, but that it would still pass to the same individuals and there wouldn't necessarily be an impact on labor allocation. That's not what I observe here. And then the third friction I observe is that there are these other inequities, and I won't delve into what they are. It's beyond the scope of this paper, and I, in fact, am studying it in other contexts. But there are lots of factors that seem to suggest that women face worse labor market opportunities. That might be due to childcare constraints, discrimination, concerns about safety, but just about all levels of human capital, I observe that women are much less likely working for a wage than men. And so, right, in a world where men and women had the same opportunities in the labor market, again, there would be this inequality in terms of who would get the land, but you could then see that just as when men are inheriting land, women could work in the labor market. That's not what I observe here. So effectively, this friction in the labor market amplifies the negative effects of a male-only inheritance regime. And so what I'll do today for my time, the rest of my time, is I'll talk about how these differences in inheritance customs and across matrilineal and patrilineal groups affect land inheritance specifically, management of land, so who's supplying land, who's the manager of land, as well as schooling decisions. And then I'll observe and show you differences in consumption beyond schooling differences that motivate unpacking differences in selection and productivity. And the intuition you should have in mind is that parents that you can imagine they're being altruistic, or you can imagine that they're investing strategically in their children, are trading off schooling and land transfers. And so that effectively they're deciding, do I invest in my child's schooling or do I pass land onto them? And that matrilineal households have more flexibility with respect to the types of investments they can make in their children. So understanding sort of all these factors at play and how they interact together requires characterizing and doing a thorough job of documenting what the economic environment is, and in particular, estimating total factor productivity of farmers to quantify what are the returns to being in farming, as well as estimating the returns to skill in the farm and non-farm sectors. And the reason I do that is to basically say, how much are these differences in these investments in schooling and land interacting with selection to amplify or affect the productivity effects? And so one thing to note as you sort of listen to what I'm going to talk about and what I'm going to show you is that I'm relying on variation across these ethnic groups and arguing that the patterns I observe are consistent with the idea that these differences in inheritance are affecting economic productivity. I think an important question to be asking is, are there other hypotheses that can explain these patterns equally well? And I think two things you should be considering in particular is, I'll show you, right, that women are inheriting more land in matrilineal. And one question to ask is this just a female empowerment effect? That effectively matrilineal empowers women more, and so across a lot of domains they're better off, and that has some economic productivity benefits. And what I'll show you is that these investments in women seem to be relatively specific to investments of land rather than more general, which I think sort of pushes a little bit against the hypothesis that it's just a story of pure female economic empowerment being beneficial in this context. And I think another question you might ask is, I'll show you these differences in terms of who's supplying their labor to farms, who's doing what types of occupations. Could there be other reasons that are correlated with inheritance but are not the inheritance themselves that are driving these facts? And one of the things I'll be showing you is that these things that I'll be controlling for, where I'm comparing matrilineal and patrilineal men and women, I'm controlling for district of birth effects within Ghana, which is a relatively fine geographic unit. I think there's something like 150,000 people in a given district. So this is, exploiting variation within a relatively fine geographic unit. So to give sort of a brief overview of inheritance and sort of what I'm talking about and what I'm doing, ethnic groups in Ghana practice unilineal descent, where both kinship and inheritance are determined through a single parent only. And so 52% practice patrilineal descent. And so this is relatively straightforward. Kinship is passed from fathers to sons, and rarely to daughters. And there's discussion of how if you pass land to your daughters, it's going to be lost to another lineage because your daughter, when they marry, their children are going to belong to another lineage. The other largest group of the population, this meta-ethnicity, the Akan, practice matrilineal descent, where kinship is determined through female relatives. And it's not symmetric to patrilineal. It's still patriarchal, and historically, land passed from men to maternal nephews. These descents also, I should note, have long histories, so there's evidence of matrilineal existing among the Akan at least as early as the 15th century. So the type of variation I'm exploiting is something that has a long-run origin. The fundamental difference is that there's been a large tension between matrilineal and colonial institutions that's not true to the same extent of patrilineal. So basically, colonial rule and the spread of religions like Christianity and Islam have emphasized the importance of nuclear family, right? That the nuclear family is the fundamental unit, which is not at all in tension with patrilineal, right? In patrilineal, if descent and inheritance is passing from fathers to sons, that's still the nuclear family. But the matrilineal, which allows for land passes to your maternal relatives, where on the other hand there's this emphasis on the nuclear family, it's led to a lot of ambiguity about who can inherit land and sort of who the rightful claimant are. And so there's discussion in the mid-20th century rather, about this idea of there being an open texture, where there's a lot of potential claimants and there's lots of people that have some right to land. And it's been argued moreover by anthropologists that this has allowed for the possibility of female inheritance. That these more flexible rules where it's like maybe my maternal nephew can inherit, my son can inherit, and some of those relatives are potentially on the female side, that it allows for women to inherit. And so what I'll document first is I'll show you that this actually indeed is what happens today, that there are increasingly women, or to a greater degree that there are women that inherit land in matrilineal. And I'll test this using the Ghana Socioeconomic Panel Survey, which is a national representative data set. It has 5,000 households across all waves of the country, or all regions of the country, rather. So first, what I'm going to show you is with respect to inheritance, farm management, and schooling, effectively a difference in difference, where I'm going to show you results with respect to a coefficient on matrilineal, female, and then the interaction between male and matrilineal. And I'll include wave fixed effects as well as district of birth fixed effects. So again, that's this relatively fine geographic unit that I'm controlling for. So first, with respect to land acquisition, so whether or not an individual inherits land or is allocated land, which is effectively inheritance, but in the form of an inter vivos transfer. And so what you can see here is that overall, across the population, women across all groups are less likely to be inheriting and receiving land than men. So this coefficient of, for example, inherited any land for female is negative 0.3. So this is saying that among people that are born in rural areas, women are 30 percentage points less likely to be inheriting land. But you can see that this gap, this male-female gap, is smaller in matrilineal. So it's attenuating by 11 percentage points in the context of inheriting, and by 8 percentage points in the context of being allocated any land. So effectively, in all contexts, men are more likely to be inheriting land, but this male-female gap is meaningfully smaller in matrilineal than it is in patrilineal. And this is true both on the extensive margin as well as in terms of acreage receiving or inheriting. This directly corresponds to the type of occupation individuals are engaged in, and specifically whether or not they're managing agricultural plots. So here, taking an indicator variable for whether or not an individual is, as an occupation, the manager of at least one plot in the household, you can see again that there's overall that women are less likely to be managing land and are cultivating less land, but that this male-female gap is meaningfully smaller in matrilineal. It's also important to note, again, with this idea of there being limited rental markets or sales markets, and indeed, I think also a limited market for labor, that managers are supplying their own labor to the plot more than 90% of the time. So it's not the case that you're inheriting and then passively having someone else manage it, where it's just purely a story of wealth and who has the land, but rather it's the case that if you're inheriting land, you yourself are supplying your labor to it. So again, in a world where this story where I'm seeing that women appear to be doing better in matrilineal is just purely about empowerment, you might expect this to spill over into other domains. So for example, maybe there's more schooling investments. And that's actually not what I observe here. So again, this is looking at comparing men and women in matrilineal and patrilineal. And you can see matrilineal individuals overall are receiving more schooling, but that this male-female schooling gap is actually, if anything, slightly larger in matrilineal. So there's more of an investment in matrilineal sons than there is in matrilineal. So there's effectively a wider gap in that context. And so this suggests to me a context where it's not just purely I invest more in my women in matrilineal, but rather I have more flexibility to pass land to them, and so then I can substitute that with investing, for example, more in my son's schooling. And then finally, the hypothesis I want to argue is that, so it is indeed the case that matrilineal households have higher per capita consumption, and that is beyond when you control for schooling and human capital. So it's there's some potentially something, and also for the same district of birth. So there's something beyond that that seems to suggest it's, that matrilineal households are earning more. And my hypothesis is that the story that I'm telling you is the responsible reason. That effectively these differences in occupation, differences in schooling, affect the allocation of labor and affect how much people earn. And so the framework I have in mind is one where parents have a goal of maximizing their children's future income. And they can facilitate this through transfers of land and investment in human capital. And parents are aware of differences in the skill intensity of sectors. So they're aware effectively that if their children go into the labor market, that schooling is going to be rewarded to a greater degree there than it is in farming. And they're also aware that women are going to face further barriers. So that if I invest in my daughter's schooling, maybe it has some benefits, but it's going to be just purely in terms of what are their earnings potential dampened by the fact that they face these other barriers. And so effectively, matrilineal relaxes this constraint that only men can inherit, but doesn't solve these other frictions present with respect to the rental markets or sales markets, or with respect to the types of other barriers that women face to being in the labor market. And so, again, I want to emphasize that this is really important and depends on the fact that you can't just rent out or sell land readily. And so what I show when I decompose and think about sort of what the differences are, I'll show you momentarily that cognitive skill is rewarded in the labor market. So when you're working for a wage, more schooling, more cognitive ability as measured by Raven's matrices or digit span is rewarded there, but it's not rewarded in farming. And consistent with that, I see selection. So I see negative selection into being a farmer relative to being in the labor market, consistent with the idea that individuals are sorting on the basis of the skill intensity of the sectors. And so the way I estimate this is the following. I'm going to effectively control for the fact that individuals are going to endogenously sort into a given occupation. So I'm going to estimate a multinomial logit of the type of occupation individuals engage in, whether they're a farmer, engaged in a business, earning a wage, or not earning individual income themselves. And what I do is I use the fact that matrilineal individuals are more likely, matrilineal men more likely to be in the labor market, matrilineal women more likely to be inherit, as a first stage, and use that to calculate an inverse Mills ratio to control for endogenous selection into a given occupation. So performing that step, what I find is that with respect to both the years of education and my measure of cognition, that individuals who have more schooling and more cognition earn more in the labor market, and they earn more wages per day. Where in contrast, when I use this estimated measure of farm productivity, adjusting for land quality or looking at profits per acre, I observe a completely flat relationship. So in this context with national data, I don't observe any positive returns associated with schooling or cognitive ability with respect to farming. Obviously, there are probably certain contexts and certain cases where that's not true, but in this national data, that's what I observe. And so then consistent with that and trying to understand how these differences in the returns to being in different skills, or the returns to skills in different sectors, and the types of investments parents make in their children, how that interacts together and how that might explain the patterns I'm observing. Here I'm showing you the patterns of selection with respect to occupation on the basis of cognitive ability. So on the x-axis here, I have my measure of cognitive ability, which is a sum of an individual's Raven score, digit span, so measures of fluid intelligence. And on the x-axis, first on this graph on the left, whether or not an individual inherited land. And so I want to take away a couple things here. First is that overall there's a pretty broad and consistent pattern where individuals are negatively selected into farming. That is, an individual's cognition score, and I can do the same thing with schooling, as it increases, they're more likely to be exiting farming. Second, at the very high levels, so the people that score very highly, regardless of the ethnicity they're in, they're not likely to be in farming. So it's sort of at some level, this pattern of inheritance doesn't bind. If you have really great outside opportunities, you're going to leave. But then third, effectively, there's this effect where sort of in the middle of the skill distribution and the left of the skill distribution, matrilineal men are being pushed out of farming and into the labor market, and in contrast, matrilineal women are inheriting land and thus applying their labor to land. And then you sort of observe the reverse pattern with respect to wage income. So again, sort of in the middle and left of the skill distribution, there's going to be this effect where matrilineal men are pushed out of farming and into the labor market. And so again, it's consistent with this idea whereby effectively they're receiving more schooling, and moreover, they're, with this more schooling and with this higher human capital in hand, choosing to exit the labor market. So there's this idea that they are strategically, once they've received school, it's affecting the type of occupation they're engaged in. And then finally, the other question is just so effectively showed you that there are differences in terms of selection and the returns to different types of sectors. There's also a question of effectively what a level effect is, right? So if you compare individuals with relatively low levels of schooling to a basic level of farming income, what is the relative benefit there? And what I observe here is that even at the lowest levels of wage income, so looking at this red indicator here for men and women, that effectively being in the bottom quartile of cognition and with respect to your wage income, it's still roughly comparable to being in the third quartile of landholding. So it basically suggests that at most levels of landholding, it seems as though there are higher returns to being in the labor market than there are to being in farming. So there's sort of this level effect benefit to the men of being pushed out of farming and into the labor market. And then finally, just briefly, I'll show that, just quickly, that a question, right? So I've shown you that men are in matrilineal, leaving farming and entering the labor market. And there's a subsequent question of what that does to farming productivity. And the sort of big picture takeaway is this column 5, that when you look at the effects of whether or not these differences of basically men leaving have negative consequences on the farm, I don't observe evidence of that. Effectively, I find that log TFP for matrilineal and patrilineal groups is equal. And again, it's women, I think overall, again, I think many of the barriers they face with respect to being in the labor market probably affect their farm productivity as well. So things like, I'm controlling for relatively good measures of land quality and input use, but you can imagine that I'm still missing something, and there's some other things that are effectively dampening their productivity. But it's still the case that because I observe this female matrilineal positive effect that offsets a negative effect of being a female farm owner in productivity, that effectively it's the case that both regimes have equal farm productivity. All right, so I know that was a lot to throw at you all at once just before lunch, but to sort of summarize these big picture ideas, I think the big picture idea is that effectively female inheritance need not come at the expense of male productivity. That in fact in a context like Ghana, where there are these growing non-farm opportunities, that it can effectively sort of push men into a sector where they would be more productive and where they're able to capture better earnings. But because women face worse economic opportunities than men do, the reverse isn't true. It isn't the case that men inheriting causes women to engage in these very productive activities outside of the farm. And again, I think it speaks to this idea that it's really fundamentally when inheritance is tied to use and it's not detachable, that there are potentially these frictions, right? That, again, if it were the case that you could just inherit land and then rent it out and then go look for a wage, and moreover have the security that if you can't find a job, you can always come back to the farm and know it's yours, we might observe very different effects. But instead here, I think one thing that might be happening, although it's sort of, the next question that's maybe begged by virtue of my results, is why more individuals aren't just leaving their farm and going, searching somewhere else. And I think fundamentally, again, potentially these frictions in the labor market or in the land market might preclude that, right? That if I go and spend a couple of years trying to find a job in the city and then it doesn't work out, if there are these use-based rights where I have to be using my land to preserve it, it's fundamentally a risk. Whereas in a world where I could just rent it out or do something in the meantime, it might be beneficial. And then finally, I think that an important implication is that it really speaks to the importance of getting into the black box of these traditional institutions. That most of what I've talked about here, and just about, in fact, all of what I've talked about, relates to traditional lands institutions. And so it's not just customary tenure or not. It's fundamentally within that black box that there are differences in terms of some that seem to be enhancing productivity more than others. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, any questions? Yes.
Hi, it's Rachel Ngai from Imperial College. I wanted to, I really like the result that you cannot just change this and then just expect to improve women's, labor market opportunity, etc., because there's other barriers. So I wonder if you can use your empirical study to learn more about this barrier. Like if you look at ILO survey, the Gallup survey that shows that the main barrier for women not going to wage employment is basically the responsibility for home production. So I don't know if you have data for home production, or maybe in your regression you can control for a number of children, because it will give a very different picture than if there's just some labor market discrimination out there, or there's no sector that use women intensively, because it's a completely different perspective in terms of policy. If it's about home production responsibility, we might want to improve the infrastructure for providing utility, electricity, so that it's more efficient for them to do home production, or we might provide like childcare facility. So this will be quite, interesting to think deeper in that. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw a couple more hands. Why don't you go ahead and then you?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So one point I would start with is your second last bullet point there. We should look this as a bigger picture, because once we start playing with inheritance rules, then we also play with selection into marriage. So we tend to see wedding as something connected to love and so forth, but mostly historically and even nowadays in several contexts, it's a matter of preserving family wealth and not fragmenting assets and so on and so forth. So once we move inheritance rules and access to resources, we could create countervailing effect. And historically, it's full of these examples. The best one is Napoleon, that brought about a possibility to register inheritance rules for women and basically stopped the out-of-family marriages. And so there was market of marriages stopped, and we increased kin-based within family marriage. So I would like to reason a little bit more in this bigger picture. On this.
Thanks. And one more question.
Thanks for this really interesting work. I want to challenge you a little bit on the extent to which you are getting into the black box of traditional institutions. So I think there's been a ton of work that's been presented at this conference and that will be presented at this conference, which really does try and delve into the specific mechanisms through which different traditional institutions are in fact kind of affecting these things or not affecting these things. And one kind of I think specific thing that's mentioned in all of these presentations is that there's a real tremendous variation in kind of the strength and endurance of these customary institutions, right? And we can even look at this, I think this is relatively well studied in Ghana. So for instance, if you look at Noah Nathan's work on kind of the acephalous communities in the north of Ghana versus kind of the strength of the kind of more centralized Akan state, but even within kind of these Akan groups, there's a lot of variation as to the extent to which these kind of customary institutions remain salient. So you can kind of think of this in terms of the either matrilineal or patrimony being a more kind of binding constraint in areas where these customary institutions are stronger versus in areas where, for instance, maybe the kind of the Akan state has lost relatively more power, more land is being titled by the state, the chiefs are less influential. And so you can think that people are less able to enforce matrilineal rules against these kind of patrilineal kind of growing norms. So I think maybe, and I think that's actually an opportunity. I think that gives you a lot more causal leverage if you can then look at an additional source of variation in the salience of these matrilineal norms. Thanks.
No, thank you. These are all good questions. Yeah, I mean, Rachel, with respect to your question, I think that's something that to some extent is feasible and to some extent not, right? So I think, or within the context of my data at least. So I do have access to data about home production, so I could look at that. And it is the case that patrilineal women are on average doing more home production. So I think that's, is a consequence. And you could argue again, I think to your point that that's, has different implications than if they just purely can't enter the labor market. I think in terms of sort of how much of that is, they would like to be in the labor market if they can, but are not, so therefore they're doing home production versus, the sort of optimal allocation would be for them to be there. I don't think I have a very good way of answering, and I think is important. I think just fundamentally, I guess I would say the share of women in this data set that are engaged in any sort of wage labor is super limited, such that trying to understand sort of what the variation is that's driving it is, I think, a bit difficult. And I think it speaks to the importance of a study that's really focused on trying to understand, at a deeper level what these sources of differences are. Yeah, with respect to your question about sort of the, what would be the consequences of adjusting inheritance and like what impacts they would have on families. I mean, I think there's a lot there that's exactly right and that I don't have the means to talk about. One thing I can say that I think is interesting is that I observe that in this context, matrilineal women are indeed more likely to be separated or divorced or have non-present spouses, which I think is consistent. I mean, it's consistent with a lot of things, but it's consistent certainly with the idea that, you know, having this land sort of improves your exit option, right? That you can afford to divorce because you have land itself. So I think, I mean, I would say I fundamentally agree that, you know, adjusting this would have big implications and lots of changes that, you know, it's hard to think about all of them in advance. But I think it's also possibility the case that, you know, and again, whether or not this is tenable or not is important, but that there would be tangible benefits to women associated with this change in inheritance. And then I agree fundamentally as well with your question, or with your point, that there's a lot of nuance and variation that, you know, I like sort of, yeah, exactly. I talk about getting into the black box, but then much of what I'm doing here is just regressing, you know, matrilineal or patrilineal. I think that I both agree fundamentally that there is, you know, within the meta-ethnicity of the econ, lots of variation within, you know, ethnic groups within patrilineal. There's lots of variation and lots of other customs at play. I do think I am a little bit just constrained by what my data can tell me, right? That I'm sort of, you know, at the limits of with the number of observations I have. And I mean, in some sense, the fact that this survey is nationally representative is great, and that I have a broad geographic scope. But I think it also means that my sort of, you know, any observations for any one specific ethnic group is relatively thin, such that the sort of ability to say, you know, this is Ashanti with a relatively binding chief versus this one isn't, it just ends up ultimately being relatively few observations. So I think I agree both that it merits further exploration and that I think the way in which I would have to do it would be through some other data beyond what I have.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Did you have a question?
Very quickly, I think, I mean, of course, your whole result hinges on the transferability of land. And given that your survey is nationally representative, I was wondering if you have any variation there that you could exploit.
Hey, that's a good question. Yeah, so just offhand, I know that like the areas closer to Accra and to Kumasi, like the two major cities, are areas that have, you know, not a lot, but a greater degree of transfer. So yeah, there's something potentially there. I mean, you know, it starts to introduce other compounds, but.
And of course, we can discuss that offline, but I think there were also a lot of donor initiatives to establish customary land secretariats, for example, that would document these things. And so I think to the extent that your sample overlaps with these, I think you could actually, potentially, you get some variation there. That would be quite interesting.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? I think we've all heard the forks or knives outside clinking. So I think this is the end of this session. Before we head to lunch, please join me one more time to a big thank you for the presenters and for the people who asked questions. Thank you.